Greetings, and welcome back to the 31 Nights of Frights. In the previous episode we talked about the British film company Hammer, and how they reinvented the Universal monster films, as well as how they dominated horror within their era. Hammer Horror pushed the boundaries of film at the time with their violence, gore and eroticism, paving the way for much more adult-oriented and less innocent horror movies. Around the time of the release of 1958's Dracula, starring Sir Christopher Lee, filming was taking place for the next motion picture from Sir Alfred Hitchcock. That film was North by Northwest, and was released in 1959 to both commercial and critical success. But it left Hitchcock in search for his next project, and he found it with Robert Bloch's novel, Psycho. This would lead to a film that is not only considered as Alfred Hitchcock's greatest masterpiece, but also one of the most iconic and influential movies of all time. Up until this point in time, horror films mainly featured monsters like those that we've seen in the Universal lineup and the Hammer horror films. But then comes along a film like Psycho that is based completely within reality. And now I'm not going to say that Psycho was the first psychological horror film, because it certainly wasn't. But what I will say is that Psycho was a cinematic landmark and fully established the psychological subgenre of horror, and to this day still remains to be one of the most influential. There's nothing I can honestly say about this film that hasn't already been said, as it's such a well-revered and well-known piece of work. But if for whatever reason you haven't seen this movie, which I imagine will be none of you, please go and see it. I will be talking about spoilers in this episode, and believe me, this is a film that if you haven't seen it, you definitely do not want spoiled. Well, where do I begin with Psycho? Well, I guess the beginning. The novel, written by Robert Bloch, was loosely inspired by the case of Ed Gein, also known as the Butcher of Plainfield. This is one of the most infamous true crime stories and is known all over the world. But for those of you who don't know the story, Ed Gein was a Wisconsin murderer whose gruesome crimes gained widespread notoriety after police discovered a wide variety of items fashioned from human remains on his property. I won't go into details about what the authorities found. It's extremely gnarly and it's quite an extensive list. But the most infamous find was the body of a missing woman that Ed had hung upside down in his shed and was gutted like a deer. Yeah. Gein lived in isolation on his family farm and was raised by an extremely strict mother who would actually punish him if he attempted to make any friends. When his mother died, Ed was devastated, and he lost the only person who he actually knew in this world. He then boarded up most of the rooms in the house that his mother would frequent to keep them absolutely pristine and almost like a shrine to his mother. Ed Gein would become the inspiration for many pop culture characters, more of which we'll get into in future episodes. But one of them, of course, was Norman Bates in Psycho. Hitchcock ended up buying the rights to Psycho and apparently ordered his personal assistant, Peggy Robertson, to buy all copies of the novel so no one could read it and therefore nobody could know all the twists. Contrary to what you may believe, however, Psycho was not a walk in the park for Hitchcock to make. Despite being one of the most acclaimed and admired filmmakers of all time, the studio Paramount Pictures were extremely hesitant about the whole project and would not greenlight the film even after Hitchcock told them he would make the film quickly and cheaply. But the studio found the subject matter of the film to be way too controversial and therefore too big of a financial risk. In response, Alfred Hitchcock offered to finance the film entirely by himself so long as Paramount would distribute it, and they agreed. This is also the reason why Psycho is shot in black and white. Even though colour films were the standard by this point, Hitchcock opted for the black and white shoot to keep costs at a bare minimum. This actually reminds me, I highly recommend checking out the 2012 film Hitchcock, starring Anthony Hopkins as Alfred Hitchcock. The film is actually based around the making of Psycho, as well as elements of Hitchcock's personal life at the time. It's a really interesting watch, and Hopkins is amazing in it as Alfred Hitchcock, as you can probably imagine. Anyway, the plot of Psycho follows Marion Crane, played by Janet Leigh, who is the mother of future Scream Queen Jamie Lee Curtis, and she steals $40,000 from a client at her work so she can marry her boyfriend Sam Loomis, played by John Gavin, and also pay pay off his debts. And if you didn't know, Donald Pleasance's character in the Halloween franchise is named after this character from Psycho. There's a lot of connections with Halloween here. So Marion flees from Arizona, and while driving on the back roads to California, gets caught in an evening rainstorm, but luckily comes across the lit up sign of the Bates Motel. Here she meets the motel manager, Norman Bates, played by Anthony Perkins, whose performance in this film is absolutely incredible. His acting is so nuanced and natural. You can tell that Perkins is fully immersed in this role. Norman is a shy and reserved young man who lives a fairly isolated life in the house overlooking the motel with his mother. After checking Marion into cabin number 1 for the night at the motel, Norman invites Marion to dine with him, resulting in a scene with some of horror's most iconic lines.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
Norman returns to the old house for the night, and Marion overhears an argument between him and his sharp-tongued, controlling mother. And then we get to the most controversial scene in the entire film, as Marion flushes the toilet. Yeah, believe it or not, this was the first time a toilet was seen flushing on a film. The Hays Code that was introduced in 1934 and lasted until the back end of the 60s was a guideline of motion picture rules that prohibited certain aspects of violence and profanity. Included in these rules was showing a toilet flush on screen. Whoever created those set of rules would definitely not be ready for what we saw next as we get to the shower scene. That's all I have to say, isn't it? Those 3 words. I don't even really have to talk about this scene, do I? It's one of the most famous scenes in cinematic history, but at the time there was nothing like it. The way Hitchcock shot that scene with the vast amount of cuts and close-ups was seriously groundbreaking camera work. It also allowed Hitchcock to suggest violence, as you never see a knife penetrate Janet Leigh in this scene. It's certainly not anything like the Hammer films anyway. It's all implied, yet somehow way more effective that way. I think all the fast cuts and all the close-ups give this sense of claustrophobia, and therefore an increased sense of threat and danger. But it also makes everything so much more chaotic and really amps up the mayhem. On top of this, we're treated to that incredible score by composer Bernard Herrmann, and that score definitely elevates the scene to that legendary status. I also want to mention that Bernard Herrmann's theme for this film is one of my favourite horror movie scores of all time, inspiring many composers to come, especially Harry Manfredini with his score for Friday the 13th. I'm sure that most people in the world know about this scene, especially since it's one of the most parodied scenes in all of cinema. But one thing is for sure, it's a legendary scene and will stand the test of time. The chocolate syrup that Hitchcock used for blood is also the perfect dessert on top. Yeah, that's what it was. And I forgot to mention, this isn't even halfway through the film. Before Psycho, a film has never killed off its main character this early on in a film, and was something completely unthought of at the time. That's another cinematic first for Psycho. This played a big part in the reason why Hitchcock ordered all theatres to refuse late entry into the film. Even the trailer states that no one will be seated after the film begins. Hitchcock did all the promotion for Psycho completely by himself. He didn't even allow any of the cast members of the film to appear on TV or in radio interviews, just in case they gave away any plot points from the film. Additionally, critics weren't allowed early access viewings of the film and had to watch it with the general public when it first came out. But the promotion certainly worked. Psycho was a massive commercial success worldwide, and the lines outside the theatres would wrap around the streets. After the shower scene, which saw Marion murdered by what appeared to be Norman's mother, Marion's sister Lila, played by Vera Miles, and Marion's boyfriend Sam go in search for her. This is where the film really begins to build up in the suspense. A private investigator called Arbogast, played by Martin Balsam, investigates the motel and the Bates house. And this leads to the scariest moment in the film in terms of a jump scare. As Arbogast walks up the stairs in the Bates house, a shadowy figure emerges from a room on the landing, and before you know it, runs out and slashes his face, causing him to fall back down the stairs. This is where I think the Bernard Herrmann score works at its best. The sudden shriek of those infamous violins work to astonishing effect here. In the finale of the film, Lila sneaks into the Bates home to find answers as Sam distracts Norman at the motel. This is the most suspenseful moment in the entire film, and ends with Lila retreating into the cellar of the house as Norman realises he is being distracted and runs up to find her. Now again, if you've not seen Psycho, which I'm sure you all have, go and watch it before you continue with my review of the film. I'm about to give away the ending. In the cellar, Lila finds Mrs. Bates sat in a chair, and upon approaching her, discovers that it's actually Mrs. Bates's corpse sat there, causing her to scream and accidentally hit the light above her. Suddenly those infamous violins begin to shriek and the camera focuses on the door as we hear someone running down the steps. Then Norman emerges in the doorway, knife in hand, dressed in a wig and a dress, with the most maniacal smile on his face. This scene, in my opinion, is the freakiest in the entire film. The shower scene is infamous and iconic, but the payoff of tension and terror in this scene is definitely the main highlight of the film for me. I love this scene. I think it's so simple yet so well executed to the point of genius. The fact that the camera goes to the doorway earlier to give us just enough time to hear the sound of Norman's steps running down the stairs, filling us with dread and anticipation for what we're about to see, is just so perfect. The imagery of this scene is bound to stay with you afterwards. This is horror brought to us by a true master of the craft, Sir Alfred Hitchcock. In the end, it turns out that Norman suffers from a split personality. After killing his mother and her lover out of jealousy, he mummified his mother's corpse and treated her as if she was still alive to cope with the guilt. Eventually, he developed an alternate personality where he acted and dressed as his mother to maintain the illusion that she was still alive. Now that Norman is so far gone, the mother personality sometimes completely takes him over. This is all explained at the end of the film by a psychiatrist. A lot of people dislike this ending scene as they feel like it's not necessary, and a small dent in what would otherwise be a perfect film. But I will be honest and say that I don't really mind the scene that much. I agree that it's not completely necessary and the audience could have worked that out for themselves, but I do understand why this scene was included at the end of the film, and I also understand why a good majority of people dislike it. The film then ends with another iconic shot and another iconic line.
Why, she wouldn't even harm a fly.
In conclusion, Psycho is one of the most influential and iconic movies in all of cinematic history. It's a timeless classic and an undeniable masterwork from one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. Whereas most horror films before it were about monsters, ghouls and ghosts, Psycho is a film grounded completely in reality, featuring the seemingly ordinary boy next door. Although there were other films like it at the time, including the British horror film Peeping Tom, released the same year, 1960, Psycho was the most commercially successful and impactful precursor to what would become the slasher film. And it was also a movie that definitely helped move horror into a whole new era. Boundaries were being pushed, and the horror genre was becoming much more serious. Psycho is a film that has gone down in history and will certainly be remembered and inspire cinema forever. So that concludes today's episode. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on this Alfred Hitchcock masterpiece. There's so much to say about this film and I only really covered a small percentage of it. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts and feelings on this classic. So join me in the next episode as we take a look at an independent horror film made by a man by the name of George A. Romero. A film that would establish a new type of monster and take the world by storm. I'll see you there.